you should really read his seerah once a year. The whole thing. At least once a year. What's that? Yeah. The story of the Prophet ﷺ should be read at least once a year. Traditionally, the Muslims tended to read it in the month of Rabi' al-Awwal. Yeah. But it should be read at least once a year. So you get used to the names and the things. Now, the Hilf al-Fuḍūl is a very interesting event in the Arab history. And the reason for it is there was an event that took place which the Arabs had an extraordinary sense of wafa, this idea that really your word was equivalent to you. If your word was sound, you were sound. If your word wasn't sound, you weren't sound. And so the Arabs really had an incredible dislike, like most people, for things like treachery, khiyana, very wretched. But at the same time, they were really a nomadic people that had only recently settled. They didn't really have a civilization like other people. And for that reason, their laws were not developed. They had pretty crude tribal laws. And in a lot of ways, it's not all that dissimilar to the laws of the street in some communities, for instance, in America, right? In other words, you have gang culture, and in gang culture, you have a gang, and the gang's tight, and the gang, they defend each other, irrespective of whether they're right or they're wrong. So if another gang takes out a gang member, then that gang member goes and gets revenge, irrespective of whether the person did it or not. Right? And this is a jahiliyyah phenomenon, and it's called tha'ar in the Arab tradition. So here, what happened, one of the things he mentions is that as the Prophet ﷺ was growing up, he was trained in war, which is important. And I'd just like to mention something about that. I think Muslims tend to have an idea that these Arabs, when time for jihad came, they all kind of just went out to fight, which is not true. And anybody who knows anything about martial arts knows that if you don't train, you lose it, right? Your body is not strong, your reflexes aren't the same. And any warrior knows that they have to continually train, which is why armies train every day, right? I mean, they do. They basically train every day. They're shooting, running, doing all these things. And so these Arabs, because their life, you had to be able to defend yourself. Because somebody might throw down the gauntlet and say, let's go. And so part of being a man in that culture meant that you were strong and that you had muru'ah, that you were able to defend yourself. You weren't a weakling. And weakness was seen as a very negative quality. So these people were physically very fit. And they were hunters. They used bows. They used to go out and practice in bows. The Sahaba used to practice in Medina. They used to practice between Asr and Maghrib. They would shoot the bows. And the Prophet was a great bowsman, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said in a hadith, whoever learns archery and then leaves it has disobeyed me. He felt that you should continue, if you're going to do that training, that you should continue it. So they were trained in swordsmanship. You had to know how to use a sword. And a sword, you can't just pick up a sword. If you've ever done any, kendo or eskrima or any type of where you have a weapon, like a sword, or you'll know very quickly that you have to train because somebody comes at you, So they definitely did that. Now, Abbas radiallahu anhu and Hamza was an extraordinary powerful man. He was also a warrior by nature. That was just part of his nature. So he was very well trained in these arts, and it would have been a normal practice for him then to have trained with his, he's his brother in Rada'ah, the Prophet. He's the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, but he's also his brother in Rada'ah. So as an uncle, he's going to have a status like the father, even though they're almost the same age. And as a brother in the Rada'ah, there's another bond there. So Hamza radiallahu anhu was very close with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, although being of average height and weight, he was, to say that he was of average strength, I don't agree with that. Because the Prophet had the strength of 40 men. And so to say that, I would not, you should kind of put a cross through that. He was not of average strength. He wrestled the greatest wrestler in Arabia, who'd never been thrown ever in his life. And he threw him twice. And the first time, the men jumped up and said, do that again. Because nobody'd ever done it. Right? And a wrestler told me he wanted to learn the move. Right? How did he do it? He wanted to see him do it again so he could learn the move. So the Prophet ﷺ had the strength of 40 men. But he definitely had an aptitude for archery, and partly because, like he points out, is true, he had very powerful eyesight. He could also see from behind like he could see in front. And whether that was before or after the prophecy, I don't know. But he could see behind him, and a man once was making fun of the way he walked, because the Prophet ﷺ walked fast and in a downward incline. And the Arabs tend to have a tabakhtur. They like to walk with a kind of, just like a tough guy type walk. And that's how they did walk. And so this man was imitating the way he was walking in a funny way. And the Prophet ﷺ saw him not like that. And he turned around and he said, be like that. And the man had like a paralysis for the rest of his life. He couldn't... And that is true that the Prophet ﷺ counted, I've seen 9, this says 12 stars in Pleiades, which is called Thuraya. And there's only 7 visible ones. There's only 7 visible ones with the human eye. Right? And he saw 12 in that constellation. Which now we understand the possibility of that because of distant stars and things like that. But he said that during that time. So that's one of his mu'jizat, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he could see those. Now during that time, the Arabs had a very interesting phenomenon. And that is, despite the fact that they fought, they had this understanding of 4 sacred months. And in those sacred months, you did not fight. In other words, these Huram months, they had an inviolability, which meant you could not, you had to wait until it was over. And this allowed them to make their pilgrimage. It allowed a safe movement of caravans. And they really respected this. And some of the ulama have indicated that this was actually in preparation for the whole concept of taqwa. Because the Arabs, interestingly enough, despite the fact they didn't have a divine revelation, they recognized that these months were sacred and we're not going to break this inviolability. And so they really kept to that. And if there was a breach in it, it was considered an incredible wrong in their culture. Now, what happens is a very tough man. He was really tough man from this tribe of Kinana, which was a very powerful Najdi tribe. He, this man Amir, what happened is he was actually jealous of him because he was given safety from one of the Arab rulers at that time. And he said, will you even make him safe from the Kinana? And the Hawazim tribe was a very powerful tribe in that area, and so was Kinana. And so what happened is that they went out on a journey together, and he got him drunk, and then he just killed him. Very treacherous thing to do. And what happened is that the man then went and took refuge, right? And he had his tribe behind him. But the Hawazim had allies, right? The Quraysh were involved as allies of Kinana. So they were actually allies of the tribe of the man who was treacherous. And what happened is that because of this alliance, they had to defend their men. This is part of the Jahili tradition. They had to defend their man against the Hawazim. And so this led to a fight, which is known as Harb al-Fijar. Right? And this has to do with the man, because it was from this treachery or mufajara of this man, who's Barrad ibn Qais, because he killed this other man, and it was done in one of the sacred months. It was done in the Shahr al-Haram. So the fact that he did it in the Shahr al-Haram and he was treacherous, it was a really bad thing to do. Despite that, the Quraysh got involved in it. And so what happens is it went on for about 4 years. And there were only actually a few days of fighting during the whole time. And this is part of the, they had a tradition in the, I think it was the Philippines, or maybe in Borneo. It's one of these islands that, when these tribes would go against each other, if it rained, they wouldn't go out because it would wreck the headdress of these warriors. And the Arabs were a bit like that. If things didn't, if it wasn't a good day to fight, they'd just call it off, right? So this is basically the type situation. Now, during that time, the Prophet ﷺ actually collected arrows for them. There was a battle in which he collected arrows, and there's also, it's said that he also actually shot some arrows on that. Now, the interesting thing that happens from this is that after this, not shortly thereafter, there was a merchant who comes, and he'd sold some goods, right, from a notable of the clan of Sahm. And then the Sahmi refused to pay the promised price, right? So this wronged merchant, he was a stranger in Mecca, didn't have any power and no tribe at this point to defend him. He went up to this mountain, Abu Qubais, which is where they used to go to give sometime talk, and in a very powerful rhetorical manner, he said, "I've been wronged, and is there anybody in this city who has a sense of justice?" And this had a powerful impact on the Quraysh. And so the Quraysh then made a promise, and this is the Hilf al-Fuḍūl. And the promise was that anyone who was oppressed, that did not have somebody to do that, then they would all be for that man, irrespective of the tribe. And this is a major change in the psychology of these people, that they would support the mazlum, even if it was against their own benefit. So this is a major change. You can imagine this is getting them prepared, really, for the concepts that Islam is going to bring, because this was very alien to this Jahili culture. And they did that, and they all went and they poured water over the black stone, and then each man drank the water, and they raised their hands and made an oath, right, that every act of oppression in Mecca, they would stand together as one man on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor, whether the oppressed were a Qurayshi or from somewhere else. So you have to understand the importance of this hilf. And then the other thing is, the Prophet ﷺ said about this, he said that I was present at an oath of allegiance in Jahiliyyah. Had I been called to it in Islam, I would have gladly responded. And this is also an indication that Muslims should be on the side of the truth, even if it's coming from non-Muslims. See, so again, it's letting the Muslims recognize that we should not be in a Jahili framework where I defend my Muslim brother against, say, a Jew or a Christian, when it's clearly the case that the Jew or the Christian is oppressed and the Muslim is oppressing. And it's really important to recognize this. This is a radical change from the psychology of the Arabs. And the Prophet ﷺ is letting us know that Islam is no different. Don't make the Muslims into a tribe where you take vengeance for your brother Muslim if he's an oppressor against an oppressed. And there's some really interesting stories in the Sirah about the Prophet supporting the non-Muslim against the Muslim when he saw that it was wrong. And Umar radiallahu anhu does this also, and this occurs several times in the history of Islam. So that's a really important aspect of this. And the man who in Mecca who was a Taymi from the clan of Abu Bakr, it was in his house, Abdullah bin Jud'an, and he's the one that offered his house for all the lovers of justice. Right? So calling people to this idea of justice. Now, the next section here is about marriage. And basically, it's interesting that the Prophet ﷺ had actually, there was a woman here who was of a marriable age named Fakhita. She's also known as Hani. And the Prophet ﷺ had actually grown up with her, knew her quite well. Now, Hani is, the Prophet ﷺ, his cousin Hubayra was the son of the mother of this clan of Makhzum, and he asked for the hand of Hani, right? And he had a lot of substance, he was a poet, he had all of these things, and so he was given in marriage, and the Prophet ﷺ, his request was unanswered. When the Prophet went to him, he was told that a generous man must requite generosity, and this was the excuse that was given. But Hani she comes up later in the story, and she's an important woman. Now the other here, which is very interesting, is Khadijah radiallahu anha, who's bint al-Khuwaylid, and Khuwaylid was of the Asad clan, and there's many people, again, that are related to her that are important both against the Prophet ﷺ and for him. And she was the first cousin of Waraqah, who has the knowledge of the book. And this would probably mean that Khadijah had heard from Waraqah during this early period that there was a prophet coming. And then we also heard about Qutayla, who's very interesting, who's the sister of Waraqah, and she actually wants to marry Abdullah. We heard that earlier, that she wanted to marry Abdullah because she recognized that this might be the man who has the prophet in his loins, or he might himself be that man, and it didn't happen. So basically, the Prophet ﷺ is now becoming known as al-Amīn. He's a young man, he's trading in the community, and Khadijah actually employs him. Right? Oh, the other thing here that's mentioned is that the Prophet ﷺ, at going to Busra, which is in the south of Syria, he took shelter beneath the tree, and there was another monk there. Now this might be the same place. The people of Syria differ on this. Some say it might be the same place where Bahira was, and others say this is actually a different event. In any case, the Prophet ﷺ sat under this tree. And when Nestor saw this thing, he went and he said, only a prophet sits under this tree. And some say it was a tree that Isa ﷺ had sat under. So when he saw that, he asked the servant, Maysara, who was Khadijah's servant, who is this man? And he said, he's from Quraysh, the people of the sanctuary. And he said, he's a prophet. So now Maysara, he wouldn't be that surprised because he's seeing some pretty extraordinary things on this journey with the Prophet ﷺ. The fact that he's clouded, the fact that there's barakah in everything that he does, even the goods that they purchase and sell, he makes much more than anybody else Maysara had ever gone on a journey with. And so what happens here is, now another thing, I think this is a really good footnote here, is that the Prophet ﷺ is identified by some of the Muslim scholars to be Shiloh, who's mentioned in Genesis 49, 1 and 10. And this is a really important verse because although the Christians interpret it to mean Christ, if you look at this, it says here, quote, "And Jacob called unto his sons," which is Yaqub, and this is the 12 tribes are coming from here. He calls to the sons and he says, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. The scepter shall not," in other words, the ahad, this oath between God and between Bani Israel, "shall not depart from Judah," right, from the Jews, "nor a lawgiver from between his feet." In other words, all of the messengers are going to come from this tribe, "until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be." So in other words, when he comes, the scepter is going to go from Bani Israel to another people. And then the gathering will be unto. So this is a prophet from Bani Israel foretelling a prophet who will not be from Bani Israel, because it doesn't mean anything. The verse doesn't make any sense. Now for the Christians to say it's Jesus, Isa alayhi salam is a direct descendant of Dawood, according to their own tradition. So he would have been from the children of Jacob or Yaqub. And so he does not fit into this category. So this is a really important event. Now what happens is, when Maysara comes back, the Prophet ﷺ had an incredibly successful journey. And Khadijah sees the truthfulness, al-Amīn, he's known as al-Amīn and all these things. She wants now to marry him. Now this is a woman who's been married twice before. She's 40 years of age, right? The Prophet ﷺ is 25. And she was a very beautiful woman, and she was still, according to the seerah literature, she was still a beautiful woman. And she wants to ask the Prophet ﷺ for marriage. And also this is not unusual for a noble woman to be able to be forthright in that way. She was also not a virgin, and so, you know, the traditional restrictions or things like that would tend to be on a virgin in not being forthright or immodest would not be placed on her in a cultural context. So she gets a woman named Nufaysa, and she asks to go and see if this is possible. And Khadijah told Waraqa, right, about, first of all, he saw these angels when they were on the journey, and then the other things that he sees. And she went and told Waraqa, and he said, if this is true, then he is the prophet that we've been waiting for. So this is an indication that Khadijah radiallahu anhu was aware of who the Prophet ﷺ was. So anyway, the Prophet ﷺ he's orphaned, he's from Bani Hashim, they're weak, they're not what they used to be when Abdul Muttalib was alive, right? Abu Talib is poor, and the only of his uncles, the only one that was really doing well was Abu Lahab. So anyway, she's asking the Prophet ﷺ, and he's saying, she wants to, to see what's going on. And this is matchmaking and things like that. And so she's asking him, what do you think of a noble woman with wealth and all these things asked you for marriage? And the Prophet said, well, who would that be, right? And he said, I don't have the ability to marry and this and that. And she said, well, what if she wanted? And who is she? Khadijah. And then he asked, how could I do that? And she said, right, leave it to me. And then he said that he would do that. So she goes, tells Khadijah, and then things begin to happen. So Hamza goes and asks for the hand in marriage of Ibn Awwam, right? So there's a lot of really amazing connections here. Anyway, Hamza goes and he asks for the hand of Khadijah, and it's agreed, and they'll give 20 she-camels, nuq, as a dowry. So now what happens, the Prophet ﷺ is establishing a household in this early community. And then she, from Khadijah, alayhi salam, she gives 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters, right? Qasim is the firstborn. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ is named Abul Qasim, which again is a clear indication. Because he actually says, Ana al-Qasim. Right? He's the distributor. He's the one that yaqsim between people. And so Abul Qasim not only has that idea of being the father of Qasim, but also being the possessor of Al-Qasim, or the one who can do that, Abul Qasim. And he's also Abu Tahir and Abu Ibrahim. So he has Qasim, Tahir, and Ibrahim. These are the three sons. All of them will die in their first few years of birth. And then the daughters he has, Zainab, followed by three other daughters, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima. Right? And then on the marriage day also he sets free Barakah, who was a slave he inherited from his father. Again, the name is, I think, very interesting. I mean, his own slave's name is Barakah. And he sets her free. And Khadijah also gave him the gift of a boy, Zayd ibn Haritha. And this is interesting too. Now at the time, Barakah goes she marries somebody from Medina, Yathrib, again ties here, and has a son who's very important, Ayman. She becomes Ayman from the son that she'll have. And then Zayd, right, he was bought in Uqab by the uncle of Khadijah here. But what happens, it's very interesting, or her nephew, what happens